The marble floors of the Grand Meridian Hotel gleamed under crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Richard Chen stood at the reception desk at 11:30 at night, his leather briefcase in one hand and his platinum credit card in the other. He had flown in from Singapore 3 hours late due to weather delays, and exhaustion pulled at every muscle in his body. The flight attendants had apologized repeatedly for the turbulence, but apologies did not erase the pounding headache that had started somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Richard was 42 years old and looked every bit the successful venture capitalist he had become. His suit was custom-tailored from a shop in Hong Kong that only accepted appointments. His watch was Swiss and worth more than a luxury car. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. Everything about Richard's appearance communicated success, power, and the expectation that the world would bend to accommodate his needs. The young woman behind the reception desk smiled professionally as she processed his late check-in. Her name tag read Amanda, and she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled countless wealthy guests during overnight shifts. She assured Richard that his penthouse suite was ready, that his preferences had been noted in the system, and that the hotel would do everything possible to ensure his comfort during his week-long stay in Boston. Richard barely listened to her carefully rehearsed welcome speech. His mind was already racing through tomorrow's schedule. He had meetings with 3 different startup founders, a lunch presentation to potential investors, and a dinner with the managing partners of a private equity firm. The Boston trip was critical to closing a deal worth $40 million. He needed to be sharp, focused, and well-rested. That meant he needed silence and 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. The elevator to the penthouse floor was as luxurious as everything else in the Grand Meridian. Soft music played through hidden speakers. The walls were paneled in dark wood that smelled faintly of lemon polish. Richard caught his reflection in the mirrored wall and saw a man who looked older than 42. The stress of constant travel and high-stakes negotiations had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. His black hair, which he kept precisely trimmed every 2 weeks, showed threads of gray at the temples. When had he started looking so tired? When had success started feeling so heavy? Richard pushed the thought away as the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse hallway. This kind of introspection was useless and distracting. He had not built a $300 million investment portfolio by questioning his choices or second-guessing his priorities. He had built it by working harder than everyone else, by making tough decisions quickly, and by never allowing sentiment to cloud his judgment. The penthouse suite was exactly what Richard had paid for. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Boston's financial district. The bedroom featured a king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets. The bathroom had a rainfall shower and heated floors. The living area included a full bar, an entertainment system, and furniture that looked like it belonged in an art museum. Everything was perfect, exactly as Richard expected from a hotel that charged $800 per night. He unpacked methodically, hanging his suits in the closet and arranging his toiletries in the bathroom with military precision. Organization was one of the habits that had carried him from a middle-class upbringing in Sacramento to the upper echelons of the financial world. His parents had both been public school teachers who emphasized discipline, education, and the value of hard work. They had been proud when Richard earned a full scholarship to Stanford. They had been amazed when he landed a job at Goldman Sachs right out of business school. But they had also been confused by the man Richard had become. His mother had died 5 years ago without understanding why her son worked 90-hour weeks and rarely visited home. His father had remarried and moved to Arizona, and they now spoke perhaps twice a year on birthdays and holidays. Richard told himself this distance was necessary, that maintaining close family relationships was incompatible with the demands of his career. Successful people made sacrifices. That was simply how the world worked. By the time Richard finished unpacking, it was nearly 1 a.m. He changed into the hotel's plush bathrobe and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch from the minibar. The alcohol burned pleasantly as it went down, taking the edge off his headache. He stood at the window looking out at the city lights and felt the familiar emptiness that always followed him into hotel rooms. This was the life he had chosen. Luxury hotels in major cities, first-class flights, expensive meals with business associates who were never quite friends. Richard owned a penthouse apartment in Manhattan that he visited perhaps 10 days per month. The rest of his time was spent traveling, closing deals, evaluating investments, and building wealth that he never seemed to have time to enjoy. What was the point of having money if you were always too busy to spend it on anything meaningful? What was the purpose of success if it left you standing alone in hotel rooms at 1 a.m, drinking scotch and staring at a city where you knew no one? Richard finished his drink and pushed these thoughts away again. He needed sleep, not philosophy. Tomorrow's meetings required him to be sharp and energetic. He could not afford to waste time on questions that had no useful answers. He was about to turn off the lights and go to bed when he heard it. The sound was faint at first, barely audible through the expensive soundproofing that the hotel advertised in its promotional materials. But as Richard stood still and listened, the sound became unmistakable. Someone was playing a piano. The music drifted up from somewhere below his suite, soft and melancholic. Richard could not identify the song, but he could hear the skill in the playing. Whoever was at the piano knew what they were doing. The notes flowed together with the kind of technical precision that came from years of practice and natural talent. Under different circumstances, Richard might have found the music beautiful. But it was 1:15 in the morning, and he needed to sleep. He needed silence and darkness and 8 uninterrupted hours before his alarm went off at 6. The piano playing, however skilled, was completely unacceptable. Richard grabbed his phone and dialed the front desk. Amanda answered on the second ring, her voice maintaining its professional cheerfulness despite the late hour. "Good evening, Mr. Chen. How can I assist you?" "There's someone playing a piano," Richard said, his voice sharp with irritation. "I can hear it in my suite. This is completely unacceptable for a hotel of this caliber. I'm paying $800 a night for peace and quiet, not a concert at 1 a.m. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. When Amanda spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly, becoming more careful. "I apologize for the disturbance, Mr. Chen. I'll look into this right away. The music is likely coming from our lobby lounge. We do have a piano there, but it shouldn't be in use at this hour. Please give me a few moments to address the situation." "I don't want it addressed in a few moments," Richard said coldly. "I want it stopped immediately. If I can still hear that piano in 5 minutes, I'll be speaking with your manager about finding a different hotel. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Mr. Chen. I'll take care of it right away." Richard ended the call and stood at the window, waiting. The piano music continued for another 2 minutes, the melody rising and falling with an emotion that Richard found irritating precisely because it was so affecting. Whoever was playing was pouring genuine feeling into the music, and something about that sincerity made Richard even more annoyed. This was not the time or place for emotional piano performances. This was a luxury hotel where guests paid premium prices for professional service and absolute peace. Then, abruptly, the music stopped. Richard waited another minute to make sure the silence would hold. When no further sounds came from below, he nodded with satisfaction and returned to the bedroom. The hotel had responded appropriately to his complaint. Order had been restored. He could now get the sleep he needed. But as Richard lay in the expensive sheets staring at the ceiling, he found that sleep did not come easily. His mind kept returning to the piano music, to the way the notes had hung in the air with such clear longing. Whoever had been playing was not just skilled. They were playing for a reason, expressing something that needed to be expressed. Richard told himself this was irrelevant. The piano player's feelings and motivations were not his concern. His concern was getting adequate rest before tomorrow's critical meetings. Nothing else mattered. He finally fell asleep around 2:30, his dreams troubled by melodies he could not quite remember when he woke. The next morning arrived with the harsh buzz of Richard's alarm at 6 o'clock. He dragged himself out of bed feeling less rested than he had hoped. The interrupted sleep and the lingering effects of jet lag left him moving slowly through his morning routine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He showered, shaved, dressed in one of his tailored suits, and reviewed his notes for the day's meetings while drinking coffee from the suite's espresso machine. By 7:30, Richard was in the hotel's executive dining room having breakfast. The room was elegant and quiet, occupied by other business travelers who ate efficiently while checking their phones and tablets. Richard ordered egg whites, whole grain toast, and fresh fruit. He skimmed through emails on his phone while he ate, responding to urgent messages and flagging others for later attention. His first meeting was not until 10, which gave Richard time to work from his suite and prepare his presentation materials. But as he signed the check for breakfast and stood to leave the dining room, he noticed something that made him pause. Through the glass doors that led to the lobby, Richard could see the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a black grand piano positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the street. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows made the polished surface gleam. And sitting at the piano, wiping down the keys with a soft cloth, was a young woman in the hotel's staff uniform. Richard walked into the lobby, drawn by curiosity he did not fully understand. As he got closer, he could see the woman more clearly. She appeared to be in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her uniform was the same burgundy and gold that all the Grand Meridian staff wore, but hers had a name tag that identified her as part of the housekeeping department. Her name was Carmen. She was humming softly as she cleaned the piano, the same melody Richard had heard the night before. Her movements were gentle and reverent, treating the instrument with obvious care and affection. There was something about the way she touched the keys, even just to clean them, that suggested a deep connection to the music. Richard approached the piano, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. Carmen did not notice him at first, too absorbed in her work. When Richard cleared his throat, she jumped slightly and turned to face him. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly, her accent revealing she was Latina, possibly from Central America. "I'm just finishing the cleaning. Were you wanting to use the piano? It will only be one more minute." Up close, Richard could see that Carmen had tired eyes despite her young age. There were shadows under them that spoke of long shifts and insufficient rest. Her hands, as she clutched the cleaning cloth, showed the rough skin of someone who worked with chemicals and hard labor. This was not someone whose job involved sitting at a desk making phone calls and reviewing spreadsheets. "I'm not here to play," Richard said. "I wanted to ask if you were the one playing last night." Around 1 in the morning. Carmen's expression shifted immediately, becoming guarded and worried. She glanced around the lobby as if checking whether anyone else was listening to this conversation. "I was playing, yes," she admitted quietly. "But only during my break. I didn't think anyone could hear me from the upper floors. Did I disturb you?" "I'm very sorry if I did." "You did disturb me," Richard said, his tone clipped and professional. "I called the front desk to complain. I assume that's why you stopped playing." Carmen's face flushed with embarrassment and something that looked like shame. She nodded slowly, not meeting Richard's eyes. "Yes, Amanda called me. She told me a guest had complained. I stopped immediately. I'm very sorry, sir. It won't happen again." There was something in Carmen's voice, a note of genuine distress, that made Richard pause. He had gotten what he wanted. The piano playing had stopped, and the woman had apologized. He should simply accept her apology and move on with his day. He had important meetings that required his full attention. But instead, Richard found himself asking a question he had not planned to ask. "How long have you been playing piano?" Carmen looked up at him with surprise, clearly not expecting this question from the guest who had complained about her playing. "Since I was 7 years old," she said softly. "My grandmother taught me. She was a music teacher back in El Salvador before she came to America." Richard nodded, processing this information. He could see the conflict playing across Carmen's face, the desire to explain herself warring with the knowledge that guests did not typically want to hear the life stories of housekeeping staff. "You're very skilled," Richard found himself saying, and was surprised to realize he meant it. "I could tell that even through the soundproofing." A small, sad smile crossed Carmen's face. "Thank you. That means a lot to hear, especially from someone who appreciated the music enough to listen, even if it was at the wrong time." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no hidden resentment. Carmen seemed genuinely grateful for the compliment despite the fact that Richard had gotten her reprimanded by the front desk. This graciousness in the face of his complaint made Richard feel something uncomfortable, something he could not quite name. "Why were you playing at 1 a.m? Richard asked, knowing he should let this conversation end but finding himself unwilling to walk away. Carmen hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal to this wealthy guest who had the power to get her in trouble or even fired. "Night shift is lonely," she finally said. "When I finish my work on the guest floors, if I have a few minutes during my break, sometimes I come down here and play. It helps me remember who I am beyond someone who cleans toilets and changes sheets." Does that make sense? It made more sense than Richard wanted to admit. He understood the need to hold on to some part of yourself that existed outside of your professional identity. But he had pushed that understanding down for so many years that acknowledging it now felt dangerous. "The piano is for guests," Richard said, his voice becoming cold again as he retreated into the safety of rules and hierarchies. "Not for staff to use during work hours, even on breaks. You should find another way to remember who you are." The light went out of Carmen's eyes. She nodded slowly, professionally, her expression becoming the blank mask that service workers learn to wear when dealing with difficult guests. "Of course, sir. You're absolutely right. It won't happen again. I apologize for the disturbance. I hope you enjoy your stay at the Grand Meridian." She gathered her cleaning supplies and walked away toward the service elevator, her shoulders slightly hunched. Richard watched her go, feeling like he had just broken something fragile without meaning to. But business was business, and rules existed for good reasons. Carmen was being paid to clean rooms, not to play piano during her shifts. Richard had been completely justified in complaining about the noise and in reminding her of the proper boundaries between staff and hotel amenities. Richard spent the rest of the morning in his suite preparing for his meetings, but his concentration kept fracturing. He would be reviewing a pitch deck or analyzing financial projections, and suddenly he would remember the look on Carmen's face when he had told her to find another way to remember who she was. The way her shoulders had slumped as she walked away. The practiced blankness that had replaced the light in her eyes. He told himself repeatedly that he had done nothing wrong. Hotels had policies for good reasons. Staff members could not simply use guest amenities whenever they pleased. If the hotel allowed Carmen to play the piano during her shifts, they would have to allow every other employee the same privileges, and chaos would result. Rules created order, and order was necessary for any organization to function properly. But the justifications rang hollow even inside his own head. Richard's 10 o'clock meeting was with the founders of a biotech startup that had developed a promising new treatment for childhood leukemia. The three founders were young, brilliant, and passionate about their work. They presented their data with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Richard why he had gotten into venture capital in the first place. Before the cynicism and the endless pursuit of returns had dulled his idealism, he had believed that investing was about more than just making money. It was about supporting innovation that could change lives. The presentation was compelling, and the financial projections were solid. This was exactly the kind of company Richard's fund looked for. High potential returns combined with genuine social impact. He should have been excited, engaged, asking probing questions and imagining the possibilities. Instead, Richard found his mind wandering back to the hotel lobby and a young woman who cleaned toilets but played piano like someone who had studied at a conservatory. "Mr. Chen?" One of the founders, a woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez, was looking at him with concern. "Did you have a question about our clinical trial results?" Richard realized he had missed something they had said. He forced himself to focus, to engage with the presentation in front of him rather than dwelling on an interaction that should have been meaningless. "I apologize," he said smoothly. "Jet lag catching up with me. Could you repeat your timeline for FDA approval?" The meeting continued, and Richard managed to pay attention well enough to ask intelligent questions and express genuine interest in their work. By the time it ended at 11:30, he had scheduled a follow-up meeting for later in the week and had committed to reviewing their full documentation package. The founders left looking pleased and optimistic, which meant Richard had done his job properly. But as he walked back through the hotel lobby toward the elevator, Richard found himself glancing at the piano. It sat empty and silent, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light. Richard wondered how many guests actually played it. He had stayed at the Grand Meridian twice before during previous trips to Boston, and he could not recall ever seeing anyone touch the keys. The piano was there as decoration, as a symbol of culture and refinement that wealthy guests expected from luxury hotels. But it served no real purpose. It was just another expensive object sitting and used in a building full of expensive and used objects. Carmen, on the other hand, would have made that piano sing with purpose and meaning. But she was forbidden from touching it because she was paid to clean rather than to create beauty. Richard shook his head, annoyed with himself for this line of thinking. He was being sentimental and foolish. Carmen had a job that she had agreed to perform in exchange for wages. If she wanted to play piano professionally, she should pursue that career instead of working in housekeeping. The world operated on contracts and agreements. People chose their paths and lived with the consequences of those choices. His lunch meeting was at a restaurant in the financial district, a place where deals got made over expensive wine and perfectly prepared seafood. Richard met with 3 potential investors, men in their 50s and 60s who had made fortunes in banking and real estate. They were interested in his fund's track record and wanted to know about his investment strategy and his plans for the next 5 years. Richard delivered his pitch flawlessly. He spoke about risk management and portfolio diversification. He cited statistics and case studies. He projected confidence and competence. By the time dessert arrived, all 3 men had verbally committed to investing a combined $12 million in his fund. It was a successful meeting by any measure. Richard should have felt triumphant as he walked back to his hotel at 3 in the afternoon. Instead, he felt exhausted and strangely empty. The hotel lobby was busy when Richard entered, full of guests checking in and out, bellhops moving luggage, and staff members moving efficiently through their assigned tasks. Richard scanned the space automatically, looking for Carmen without consciously deciding to look for her. But she was not there. She was probably upstairs somewhere, cleaning rooms on one of the guest floors. Richard rode the elevator to his suite and changed out of his suit into more casual clothes. His next meeting was not until 6, which gave him several hours to work or rest. He should review the documentation package from the biotech startup. He should return phone calls and answer emails. He should use this time productively. Instead, Richard found himself standing at the window, looking out at the city and thinking about his parents. His mother had been a music teacher before budget cuts eliminated her position at the public school where she worked. She had loved music with a passion that Richard had never quite understood. She would talk about how a well-played sonata could communicate emotions that words could never capture. How music connected people across cultures and generations. How playing an instrument required discipline but also demanded that you open your heart. Richard had inherited his mother's discipline but not her ability to open his heart. He had learned to work hard and achieve goals, but he had forgotten how to feel things deeply. Or perhaps he had deliberately taught himself not to feel deeply because emotions were inefficient and got in the way of making tough business decisions. His mother would have been disappointed in the man he had become. Not because he was unsuccessful, but because he had become someone who would complain about a housekeeper playing piano during her break. Someone who would tell a young woman to find another way to remember who she was, as if her identity was something disposable that could be easily replaced. Richard's phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was his assistant calling from New York with updates on several ongoing deals. Richard spent the next hour on conference calls and video meetings, slipping back into his professional identity like putting on a familiar coat. This was who he was. This was what he did. Everything else was just distraction and pointless introspection. By the time his 6 o'clock dinner meeting arrived, Richard had convinced himself that he had wasted enough mental energy thinking about Carmen and the piano incident. He met with the managing partners of a private equity firm at one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. The conversation flowed smoothly through multiple courses. They discussed market conditions and regulatory environments. They traded information about which startups were seeking funding and which were likely to fail. Richard played his role perfectly. He was charming without being obsequious. He was knowledgeable without being arrogant. He demonstrated exactly the right balance of confidence and caution that made wealthy people trust him with their money. By the time dinner ended at 9:30, he had laid the groundwork for what would likely become a $20 million partnership. It was another successful day in a career built on successful days. Richard returned to the hotel feeling like he had accomplished everything he needed to accomplish. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more deals, more incremental progress toward building greater wealth and influence. But as Richard walked through the hotel lobby toward the elevator, he heard it again. The piano music, soft and melancholic, floating through the air like something from a dream. Richard stopped walking and turned toward the sound. The lobby was nearly empty at this late hour. The reception desk was staffed by a young man Richard did not recognize. The concierge stand was closed for the night. And sitting at the piano with her back to the lobby was Carmen. She was playing the same piece Richard had heard the night before, but now he could see her as she played. Her posture was perfect, her back straight and her shoulders relaxed. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced grace, drawing out notes that seemed to hang in the air before fading into silence. She was completely absorbed in the music, unaware that anyone was watching her. Richard glanced at his watch. It was 9:45. Carmen's break was probably scheduled for 10 o'clock, which meant she was playing on her own time, perhaps a few minutes before her shift officially ended. She was not technically violating any rules, though Richard suspected the hotel's management would still prefer that housekeeping staff did not use guest amenities even when off duty. He should have walked away. He should have gone to his suite and left Carmen to her music. He had already interfered enough in her life by complaining the previous night. Getting involved further would be inappropriate and would serve no useful purpose. But Richard found himself walking across the lobby toward the piano instead. His feet carried him forward even as his rational mind told him to turn back. Carmen did not notice his approach until he was standing just a few feet away. Then she looked up, startled, and her hands froze above the keys. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "I'm so sorry. I know you said I shouldn't play, but my shift is over in 10 minutes, and I thought maybe if I was technically off duty it would be acceptable. I'll stop right now if you want me to." She started to stand, but Richard held up his hand to stop her. "Please," he said quietly. "Don't stop. I came to listen, not to complain." Carmen looked at him with confusion and suspicion, as if she thought this might be some kind of trap. Richard could not blame her for that reaction. Yesterday he had been the angry guest who got her reprimanded. Today he was acting like an entirely different person. She had no reason to trust this sudden change. "I mean it," Richard said, trying to make his voice gentle instead of commanding. "I'd like to hear you play. If you're willing to let me listen." Carmen studied his face for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether he was sincere or whether this was some elaborate setup that would end with her getting fired. Finally, slowly, she settled back onto the piano bench. "What I was playing is a nocturne," Carmen said softly. "By Chopin. It's called Opus 9, Number 2. Do you know it?" Richard shook his head. He knew almost nothing about classical music. His education had focused on business and finance, subjects that would help him make money. Art appreciation had seemed like an indulgence he could not afford when he was working his way through college and business school. "It's one of the most beautiful pieces ever written," Carmen continued. Chopin composed it when he was only 20 years old. Can you imagine being that young and creating something so perfect? She placed her hands on the keys again and began to play. The music was indeed beautiful, achingly so. The melody was simple but profound, communicating a depth of feeling that made Richard's chest tighten. He had heard this piece before somewhere, perhaps in a movie or a commercial, but hearing it played live was entirely different. Carmen was not just reproducing notes on a page. She was channeling something real and genuine through her fingertips. Richard sat down in one of the nearby chairs and closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. How long had it been since he had simply listened to something beautiful without checking his phone or thinking about work? How many years had passed since he had allowed himself to just experience art without analyzing its commercial value or worrying about how it fit into his schedule? When the piece ended, silence filled the lobby like an echo of the final notes. Richard opened his eyes to find Carmen watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "That was extraordinary," Richard said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "You have remarkable talent." Carmen smiled, but it was a sad smile that did not reach her eyes. "Talent doesn't pay the bills," she said simply. "Cleaning hotel rooms pays the bills." The statement hung between them, a truth so obvious and yet so devastating that Richard did not know how to respond. Finally he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since he first heard her play. "Why aren't you performing professionally? With your skill, you could be playing in concert halls or teaching at a music school." Carmen's laugh was short and bitter. "You think I haven't tried? I studied music performance at the San Salvador Conservatory before my family came to the United States. I was good enough to earn a scholarship, good enough that my teachers said I had a real future. But scholarships don't feed your family when your father dies and your mother gets sick. Scholarships don't pay for medicine or rent or food." She looked down at the piano keys, her fingers tracing patterns in the air above them without actually pressing down. "We came to Boston 5 years ago because my aunt lives here and said she could help us find work. My mother has diabetes and needs medication that costs $300 a month even with the assistance program. My younger brother is in high school and needs books and supplies. My older sister works 2 jobs but she has 3 children of her own to support. Someone had to bring in steady money with health insurance. So I got this job." Richard felt something crack open inside his chest. Here was the answer to why Carmen played piano at 1 in the morning during her breaks. Because those stolen moments were the only time she had to connect with the person she used to be. The person she had trained to become. The person who had sacrificed her dreams so her family could survive. "What about playing part-time?" Richard asked. "Teaching piano lessons on your days off?" "I tried that when I first moved here," Carmen said. "I put up flyers at community centers and churches. I got a few students, mostly children whose parents couldn't afford real music teachers. But the scheduling was impossible. I work 5 nights a week from 5 in the evening until 2 in the morning. My days off are Tuesday and Wednesday, which doesn't work for most students. And the families who could pay decent rates want teachers with American credentials, not certificates from a conservatory in El Salvador." She stood up from the piano bench and began straightening the sheet music that sat on the stand, her movements suddenly brisk and businesslike. "But that's all just, how do you say, water under the bridge. I have a steady job with health insurance. My mother's diabetes is controlled. My brother is doing well in school. My nieces and nephews have food to eat. Those are the things that matter. The piano is just, it's something I do for myself when I have a spare moment. It's not important." Richard could hear the lie in that last sentence. The piano was vitally important to Carmen. It was the thread that connected her present self to her past dreams. It was proof that she had once been more than a hotel housekeeper, that she still contained multitudes even when the world only saw her uniform and her service. "Carmen," Richard said carefully, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him with surprise. "When I complained about your playing last night, I wasn't thinking about you as a person. I was only thinking about myself and what I needed. I didn't consider that you might have reasons for playing that were more important than my sleep schedule. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I'm sorry." Carmen's eyes widened. Clearly she had not expected this from the wealthy guest who had gotten her in trouble. For a moment she seemed at a loss for words. Then she shook her head slowly. "You don't need to apologize, Mr. Chen. You're a guest. You paid for a quiet room. You had every right to complain if I was disturbing you. That's how hotels work. Guests come first." "But that's not how a human being should work," Richard said, surprising himself with his own vehemence. "I should have come down here and talked to you instead of calling the front desk. I should have asked why you were playing instead of just demanding that you stop. I should have treated you like a person instead of like an inconvenience." Tears formed in Carmen's eyes, and she blinked them back quickly. Richard could see that his words had touched something deep, some wound that had been covered over but never healed. "Most guests don't think about us at all," Carmen said quietly. "We're invisible to them. We're the people who make their beds and clean their toilets and empty their trash, but we're not real to them. Do you know how many guests I pass in the hallways who look right through me like I don't exist? How many times I've said good morning and had people just walk past without acknowledging that I spoke?" Richard thought about all the hotels he had stayed in over the years. All the housekeepers and bellhops and desk clerks who had served him. How many of their names had he learned? How many of them had he seen as actual human beings with their own dreams and struggles and interior lives? The answer made him ashamed. "I've been one of those people," Richard admitted. "I've walked past staff members without really seeing them. I've been so focused on my own concerns that I forgot to recognize the humanity of the people serving me. That's not acceptable, and I'm sorry." Carmen wiped at her eyes and gave Richard a shaky smile. "You're apologizing for being a typical hotel guest. That's very kind, but it's not necessary. This is just how the world works." "Maybe that's the problem," Richard said. "Maybe we've all accepted that this is how the world works when it shouldn't work this way at all." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of these revelations settling between them. Richard knew he should say good night and return to his suite. This conversation had already become far more personal than was appropriate between a guest and a hotel employee. But he found himself reluctant to end it, reluctant to return to his empty rooms and his empty life. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said. "Why do you keep playing? If it makes you sad to remember what you've lost, why not just let it go?" Carmen looked at the piano with such profound affection that Richard felt he was intruding on an intimate moment. "Because letting it go would mean losing the last piece of who I really am," she said simply. "My job defines how I spend most of my time and how other people see me. But the piano reminds me that I'm more than my job. That I once dreamed of bigger things. That somewhere inside this woman in a housekeeping uniform is still the girl who won the San Salvador Youth Piano Competition when she was 16. She turned back to Richard with fierce determination in her eyes. "I play because giving up would mean admitting that circumstances have beaten me. That poverty and bad luck and family obligations have erased the person I worked so hard to become. And I refuse to admit that. Even if I only get 15 minutes during my break twice a week, those 15 minutes are mine. Nobody can take them away from me." Richard felt tears forming in his own eyes now. When had he last cried? When had he last allowed himself to feel something deeply enough that it moved him to tears? He could not remember. He had spent so many years building walls around his emotions, telling himself that successful people did not let feelings interfere with business decisions. But standing in this hotel lobby at 10 o'clock at night, listening to a housekeeper talk about holding on to her dreams despite overwhelming odds, Richard realized those walls had not protected him. They had just made him alone. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion he could not quite control. "Thank you for sharing that with me. And thank you for not giving up on your music." Carmen smiled, a real smile this time that reached her eyes and transformed her tired face into something luminous. "Thank you for listening, Mr. Chen. Most people don't." She gathered the cleaning supplies she had left near the piano earlier and prepared to leave. Her shift was over, and she probably had a long commute ahead of her before she could finally rest. "Carmen," Richard called out as she started to walk away. She turned back to face him. "Would you play one more piece before you go? Whatever your favorite is. I'd really like to hear it." Carmen hesitated, glancing toward the reception desk where the young man on duty was pointedly not paying attention to them. Then she smiled and returned to the piano. "My favorite is difficult to play," she warned. "It's by Rachmaninoff. Very romantic, very emotional. It might be too much after our conversation." "I think I can handle it," Richard said with a small smile. Carmen settled back onto the bench and closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Then she began to play, and the music that poured forth was unlike anything Richard had ever heard. It was passionate and turbulent and achingly beautiful. Carmen's whole body moved with the music, swaying with the melody and attacking the dramatic passages with controlled power. Richard watched her play and saw not a housekeeper but an artist. Someone who had trained for years to master her craft. Someone who had sacrificed her dreams but refused to abandon them entirely. Someone who created beauty in a world that gave her very few opportunities to do so. When the piece ended, Carmen sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. Then she stood and turned to Richard with a question in her eyes. "What did you think?" "I think you're not just talented," Richard said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I think you're gifted. I think you have something rare and precious that deserves to be heard by more people than just an insomniac businessman in a hotel lobby." Carmen's expression was complicated, mixing gratitude with grief. "That's very kind of you to say. But gifts don't matter much when you have responsibilities and bills to pay." She picked up her cleaning supplies again, and this time Richard let her go. He watched her walk to the service elevator and disappear behind its closing doors. Then he stood alone in the lobby, feeling like something fundamental had shifted inside him. Richard returned to his suite but found he could not sleep. He sat at the window looking out at the city lights and thinking about Carmen's words. About how she refused to let circumstances erase who she really was. About how she held onto her music even when the world told her it was impractical and foolish. What was Richard holding on to? What piece of himself had he refused to let go even as he built his successful career? He searched his memories for something, anything, that represented who he really was beneath the expensive suits and the impressive business credentials. He thought about his mother teaching him to play chess when he was 8 years old. How she had emphasized that the game was not just about winning but about thinking 3 moves ahead and understanding your opponent's perspective. He thought about his father taking him to baseball games and explaining that teamwork mattered more than individual statistics. He thought about Sunday dinners when his family would sit around the table for hours, talking and laughing and simply enjoying each other's company. When had Richard stopped enjoying anything? When had his life become nothing but work and travel and the endless pursuit of greater returns on investment? He could not pinpoint the exact moment when he had lost himself, but he knew with sudden certainty that Carmen was right. Letting go of the things that made you who you really were meant letting circumstances win. Richard pulled out his laptop and began researching something he should have researched years ago. Music education programs in Boston. Scholarships for adult students. Conservatories that accepted international credentials. Ways that talented musicians without traditional paths could still build careers in performance or teaching. He worked through the night, taking notes and making lists. By the time dawn broke over Boston, Richard had a plan forming. It was probably foolish. It was certainly outside his normal area of expertise. But it felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in years. The next morning, Richard skipped his usual early workout and instead went down to the hotel's business center. He printed out the information he had compiled during the night and organized it into a folder. Then he sat in the lobby, drinking coffee and waiting. Carmen arrived for her shift at 4:30 in the afternoon. Richard saw her come through the staff entrance carrying her work bag over one shoulder. She looked exhausted, probably because she had gotten very little sleep between leaving the hotel at 2 in the morning and returning 14 hours later. She did not see Richard at first. She headed straight for the service elevator, ready to begin another night of cleaning rooms and scrubbing bathrooms and making beds for guests who would never know her name. But Richard stood up and intercepted her before she reached the elevator. "Carmen," he said. "Do you have a moment?" She turned and saw him, and confusion crossed her face. What could this wealthy guest possibly want from her now? But her professional training took over and she smiled politely. "Of course, Mr. Chen. How can I help you?" Richard held out the folder he had prepared. "I spent last night researching music programs and opportunities in Boston. I found several things I think might interest you. Would you be willing to look at this information and consider whether any of it might work with your schedule and your family's needs?" Carmen took the folder hesitantly, as if she thought it might explode in her hands. She opened it and began leafing through the printed pages. Richard watched her eyes widen as she read about scholarship programs, about part-time teaching opportunities at community music schools, about conservatories that offered evening classes for working adults. "Mr. Chen," Carmen said slowly, "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because you deserve a chance to be more than a housekeeper," Richard said simply. "Because your gift is too valuable to waste. Because last night you reminded me that holding on to who you really are matters more than almost anything else." Tears filled Carmen's eyes again, and this time she did not try to blink them back. They rolled down her cheeks as she continued looking through the folder, her hands shaking slightly. "I can't afford most of these programs," she said finally. "Even with scholarships, I'd still need money for supplies and transportation and all the other costs. And I can't quit this job because my family depends on my income and my health insurance." "I know," Richard said. "That's why I want to propose something. I'd like to sponsor your education. I'll pay for whatever program you choose, plus cover any related expenses. In exchange, all I ask is that you promise to keep playing. Keep creating beauty in the world. And someday, when you're successful and established, help another talented person who needs the support you needed." Carmen stared at him like he had just spoken in a foreign language. Her mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. "You want to pay for my education? Why? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why would you do this?" Richard thought about how to answer that question honestly. "Because 2 nights ago I complained about you playing piano and made you feel small and ashamed. Because yesterday I told you to find another way to remember who you are, as if your identity was disposable. Because I've spent 20 years building wealth without stopping to think about what that wealth should be used for. And because you showed me that success without humanity is just emptiness dressed up in expensive clothes." He took a breath and continued. "I've made a lot of money in my career, Carmen. More money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But I've never used it for anything that really mattered. I've never changed anyone's life or made the world better in any meaningful way. You could give me that opportunity. You could help me become someone my mother would have been proud of." Carmen was crying openly now, not even trying to wipe away the tears that streamed down her face. The folder slipped from her hands and papers scattered across the lobby floor. She did not bend to pick them up. Instead she looked at Richard with an expression of such raw hope and disbelief that it broke his heart. "Are you serious about this? This isn't some kind of joke or test?" "I'm completely serious," Richard said. "And I know this is overwhelming and probably sounds too good to be true. You don't have to decide right now. Take the information home. Talk to your family. Think about what you really want. Then let me know if you'd like my help pursuing it." Carmen bent down and gathered the scattered papers with shaking hands. She clutched the folder to her chest like it was something precious and fragile. "Mr. Chen, I don't know what to say. Nobody has ever done anything like this for me before. Nobody has ever believed in my music enough to invest in it." "Then it's past time someone did," Richard said gently. "You have a gift, Carmen. The world needs to hear it." She wiped at her tears and tried to compose herself, clearly aware that she was crying in the middle of the hotel lobby while wearing her work uniform. But the happiness radiating from her face was impossible to hide. I need to start my shift, Carmen said reluctantly. My supervisor will be upset if I'm late. But Mr. Chen, thank you. Thank you so much for seeing me as more than just the housekeeper. Thank you for caring about my dreams. Thank you for reminding me that dreams matter, Richard replied. Carmen walked toward the service elevator carrying the folder like it contained winning lottery tickets. Richard watched her go and felt something he had not felt in years. He felt like he had done something that genuinely mattered. Something that would ripple outward in ways he could not predict or control. Something that made the universe slightly better than it had been before. He returned to his suite and looked at his calendar for the week ahead. More meetings with startup founders and investment committees. More conference calls and pitch presentations. More incremental progress toward accumulating greater wealth. But now Richard understood that wealth was just a tool. What mattered was how you used it. What mattered was whether you deployed it to create opportunity and beauty and hope in a world that too often crushed those things. Richard picked up his phone and called his assistant in New York. I need you to set up a meeting with our legal team, he told her. I want to create a foundation that supports musicians from underserved communities. Scholarships, instrument purchases, performance opportunities, whatever they need. I want to have a full proposal ready by the end of the month. His assistant sounded surprised but took careful notes. Richard knew she would have questions later about this sudden shift in his priorities. But right now he did not want to explain. He just wanted to start building something that would outlast his own life and make a real difference in the lives of people like Carmen. The rest of Richard's week in Boston unfolded with strange duality. On the surface, everything proceeded exactly as planned. He attended his meetings and closed his deals. He evaluated investments and negotiated terms. He played his role as the successful venture capitalist with perfect precision. But underneath that surface performance, something fundamental had changed. Richard found himself paying attention to people he would normally have overlooked. The server who brought his breakfast. The taxi driver who took him to appointments. The security guard who worked nights at the office building where he had meetings. He started asking them questions. Not intrusive questions, but simple inquiries about their lives and their dreams. And what he discovered astonished him. The breakfast server was studying engineering online, trying to build a better life for herself. The taxi driver had been a doctor in Syria before the war forced his family to flee. The security guard was writing a novel during his overnight shifts. Everyone had a story. Everyone had dreams and talents that the world had not made space for. Richard had spent 2 decades walking past these people without really seeing them, and now he could not unsee them. On his last night in Boston, Richard returned to the hotel at 9:30 and went straight to the lobby. Carmen was there, finishing the evening cleaning. When she saw him, her face lit up with the kind of joy that made her look 10 years younger. Mr. Chen, she said, hurrying over to him. I've been hoping to see you before you left. I talked to my family about your offer. We spent hours discussing it, weighing all the options. Richard felt his stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. Had Carmen decided his offer was too strange to accept? Had her family convinced her it was inappropriate to take money from a hotel guest? And what did you decide? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Carmen's smile grew even wider. I decided yes. If your offer is still open, I would be honored and grateful to accept your help. I applied to 3 of the programs you researched. The evening courses at the New England Conservatory Extension Division, the Community Music School Teaching Program, and the Adult Education Scholarship at Berkeley. I won't know if I'm accepted for several weeks, but just applying felt like believing in myself again. Richard felt relief and happiness wash over him in equal measure. That's wonderful news, Carmen. I'm so glad you're pursuing this. And yes, my offer absolutely still stands. Whatever program accepts you, whatever you need to make it work, I'll make sure you have it. Carmen's eyes filled with tears for what must have been the 100th time since they met. But these were purely happy tears with no sadness mixed in. There's something else, Carmen said, her voice trembling slightly. I've been thinking about what you said about paying it forward. About helping someone else someday when I'm established. And I realized I want to do more than that. She pulled out a notebook from her work bag, one of those cheap spiral-bound ones from a drugstore. But the pages were filled with neat handwriting and carefully drawn diagrams. If I can get my music career started again, I want to create a program to teach piano to children whose families can't afford lessons. Free classes on weekends at community centers and churches. I could recruit other musicians to volunteer as teachers. We could provide instruments and sheet music to kids who need them. Carmen looked up at Richard with fierce determination. You showed me that one person's help can change everything. I want to be that person for other musicians who are struggling. I want to create the opportunities one never had when I was young and trying to build a career. Richard felt that crack in his chest widen further, letting in light and warmth that he had forgotten existed. This was what transformation looked like. Not just helping one person, but creating a chain reaction of generosity and support that would spread far beyond anything he could have imagined. Carmen, that's an incredible vision. When you're ready to start that program, I'd like to help fund it. Through a foundation I'm creating specifically to support musicians like you. They talked for another hour about Carmen's dreams and plans. About how she would balance her studies with her work schedule and her family responsibilities. About what success would look like and how long it might take to achieve. Richard took notes on his phone, already thinking about how his new foundation could address the systemic problems that created situations like Carmen's. When they finally said goodnight, Richard felt like he was saying goodbye to someone who had fundamentally altered his understanding of what mattered in life. Carmen had shown him that wealth without purpose was just numbers in a bank account. That success without humanity was just an elaborate form of loneliness. Richard flew back to New York the next morning carrying more than just his laptop and his business papers. He carried a new sense of mission that would reshape his entire approach to work and life. The deals he had closed in Boston would generate significant returns for his fund. But the investment he had made in Carmen's future would generate something far more valuable. It would generate hope and opportunity and beauty in a world that desperately needed all three. 6 months later, Richard received an email that made him smile so wide his assistant asked if he had won the lottery. Carmen had been accepted to the evening program at New England Conservatory. She was beginning her studies in September. And she had already started planning her free music education program for children from low-income families. The message included a photograph of Carmen sitting at a piano, her hands on the keys, looking directly at the camera with an expression of pure joy and determination. Below the photo she had written a simple message that Richard would keep forever. 2 years had passed since Richard first heard Carmen play piano in that hotel lobby. He was back in Boston for another business trip, but this time his schedule included something that had nothing to do with venture capital or investment returns. He had cleared his entire Saturday evening for a piano recital at a small concert hall near Berklee College of Music. The venue was modest compared to the grand symphony halls where famous pianists performed. The seats were simple, the stage was small, and the piano looked well used rather than pristine. But none of that mattered to the 200 people who filled every available chair. They were there to support students and emerging musicians, people who were building careers against significant odds. Richard sat in the third row, feeling more nervous than he had felt before any business presentation. Carmen was scheduled to perform in the second half of the program. He had not seen her in person since that week in Boston 2 years ago, though they had exchanged emails regularly. She had sent him updates about her studies, her teaching work, and the free music program she had launched for children in underserved neighborhoods. The first half of the recital featured talented young musicians performing pieces by Mozart and Beethoven. Richard watched them and thought about how many gifted people never got chances like this. How many Carmens were out there cleaning hotel rooms or working factory jobs, their talents buried under the weight of economic necessity. That question had driven Richard to expand his foundation beyond what he had originally envisioned. The Richardson Foundation for the Arts now provided scholarships to over 50 musicians, funded 3 community music schools, and supported programs that brought free music education to low-income neighborhoods in 12 cities. Richard had discovered that investing in human potential generated returns that no stock portfolio could match. After intermission, Carmen walked onto the stage. She wore a simple black dress and her hair was styled elegantly. But what struck Richard most was the confidence in her posture. This was not the exhausted housekeeper he had met 2 years ago. This was an artist stepping into her rightful place. Carmen sat at the piano and adjusted the bench. The audience fell completely silent. Then she began to play, and the music that filled the hall was transcendent. She performed the Rachmaninoff piece she had played for Richard that night in the hotel lobby, but now it sounded even more powerful. Carmen had refined her technique through hundreds of hours of practice and study. Every note was perfect, every phrase shaped with masterful control. But technique alone could not explain the emotional depth of her performance. Carmen played like someone who had fought for every opportunity to sit at that piano. Like someone who knew what it meant to have your dreams deferred but not destroyed. Like someone who had been invisible to the world but had refused to let that invisibility define her worth. When the final notes faded, the audience erupted in applause. People stood from their seats, some wiping tears from their eyes. Richard stood too, clapping until his hands hurt. He watched Carmen bow gracefully, accepting the recognition she had earned through talent and determination and sheer refusal to give up on herself. After the recital, there was a reception in the lobby. Richard waited in line with other audience members to congratulate the performers. When he finally reached Carmen, her face transformed with recognition and joy. "Mr. Chen. You came. I wasn't sure you would be able to make it with your business schedule." "I wouldn't have missed this for anything," Richard said honestly. "Carmen, you were extraordinary. That performance was worth every dollar I've invested in the foundation and more." Carmen's eyes glistened with emotion, but these were happy tears mixed with pride rather than the desperate sadness he remembered from their first conversations. "I have so much to tell you," Carmen said, taking his hand. "Can you stay for a few minutes? There's someone I want you to meet." She led Richard through the crowd to a corner where a teenage girl stood holding a violin case. The girl looked nervous but excited, clearly overwhelmed by being at a real concert hall. "Mr. Chen, this is Isabella. She's one of the first students in my free music program. She's been studying violin for 18 months now, and she's incredibly talented." Isabella smiled shyly and shook Richard's hand. "Miss Carmen says you're the reason her program exists," Isabella said in accented English. "My family could never afford violin lessons. But now I get to study every Saturday, and Miss Carmen found someone to donate a violin I could use. It's changed my whole life." Richard felt that familiar warmth spreading through his chest. This was the ripple effect he had hoped for. Helping Carmen had enabled her to help Isabella, who would someday help someone else. "What do you want to do with your music, Isabella?" Richard asked. "I want to be a music teacher," Isabella said with certainty. "I want to help other kids like me who love music but don't have money for lessons. I want to give them the same chance Miss Carmen gave me." Richard looked at Carmen and saw her beaming with pride at her student. This was what transformation looked like when it spread beyond just one person. This was how change multiplied and grew into something larger than anyone could have planned. Over the next hour, Richard met a dozen more of Carmen's students. Children from immigrant families, kids from housing projects, teenagers juggling school and jobs and family responsibilities. All of them had found their way to music through Carmen's program. All of them had stories about how learning an instrument had changed their sense of what was possible in their lives. Before he left the reception, Carmen pulled Richard aside for a private conversation. "I have news," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I've been offered a teaching position at the New England Conservatory. Just part-time to start, but it's a real faculty appointment. I'll be teaching piano to undergraduate students." Richard grabbed her in an impulsive hug, something he never did in professional settings. But Carmen was not just a recipient of his philanthropy anymore. She had become someone whose success made him genuinely happy. "That's incredible, Carmen. Your students will be so lucky to learn from you." "I'm keeping my community program too," Carmen said firmly. The conservatory position will give me enough income that I can finally quit the hotel job. Which means I'll have more time and energy to expand the free music classes. I'm planning to add weekend sessions and maybe even a summer intensive program. She paused and looked at Richard with an expression of deep gratitude. None of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped to listen that night. If you hadn't seen me as more than just a housekeeper. You gave me my life back, Mr. Chen. I'll spend the rest of my career trying to do the same thing for other people. Richard shook his head slowly. You're the one who did the hard work, Carmen. You're the one who refused to let circumstances destroy your dreams. I just provided some financial support. The courage and determination were all yours. They talked for a few more minutes about Carmen's plans for the future. Then Richard said goodbye and walked out into the cool Boston evening. He stood on the sidewalk watching people stream out of the concert hall, their faces bright with the joy that live music created. His phone buzzed with an email from his assistant. There was an urgent matter that needed his attention, some crisis with one of his portfolio companies. 2 years ago, Richard would have immediately called to handle the problem. He would have let the crisis consume his evening and probably his entire weekend. But tonight Richard turned off his phone and put it in his pocket. The crisis would still be there on Monday. Right now, he wanted to walk through Boston and think about what he had just witnessed. He wanted to savor the feeling of having invested in something that generated beauty and opportunity rather than just financial returns. Richard found himself walking toward the Grand Meridian Hotel without consciously deciding to go there. When he arrived, he stood outside looking at the building where everything had changed. The hotel looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago. Same marble facade, same elegant entrance, same promise of luxury and professional service. But Richard was entirely different. That angry, entitled guest who had complained about piano music no longer existed. Or rather, he had been transformed into someone who understood that wealth meant nothing without compassion. That success was worthless if it came at the cost of your humanity. That the people society rendered invisible often had the most to teach about what truly mattered. Richard walked into the lobby and saw the piano sitting in its familiar spot near the windows. A young man in a business suit was playing something classical, his technique adequate but uninspired. Hotel guests walked past without stopping to listen. The piano was just background ambience again, decorative rather than meaningful. Richard walked over to the reception desk where a woman he did not recognize greeted him professionally. He asked if Amanda still worked there, and the receptionist said she had been promoted to assistant manager and was currently off duty. Is there something I can help you with, sir? The receptionist asked. Richard almost said no. But then he thought about Carmen and Isabella and all the students whose lives had been changed by one person's willingness to take a risk on their potential. Actually, yes, Richard said. I'd like to make a donation to your staff education fund. If you don't have one, I'd like to help create one. A fund that would support any employee who wants to pursue additional education or training. No restrictions on what they study, just resources to help them build the futures they dream about. The receptionist looked surprised but pulled up information on her computer. We do have an employee assistance program, but it's quite limited. Most staff members don't know about it or can't access it because the eligibility requirements are so strict. Then let's change that, Richard said, pulling out his checkbook. How much would it take to expand the program so that every employee could benefit? They spent 20 minutes working through the details. Richard ended up writing a check that would fund scholarships for 50 employees per year, covering tuition and books and supplies for any accredited educational program. The hotel's parent company agreed to match his donation, doubling the impact. As Richard left the Grand Meridian for what might be the last time, he felt a sense of completion. The circle had closed. The place where he had learned to see people rather than just service providers would now become a place where other employees could pursue their own transformations. Richard's phone was full of missed calls and urgent emails by the time he turned it back on at his own hotel later that evening. But instead of immediately diving into crisis management, he drafted an email to his entire investment team. The message outlined a new direction for their fund. Going forward, they would evaluate potential investments not just on financial returns but on social impact. They would prioritize companies that treated employees well, that created opportunities for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, that contributed something meaningful beyond shareholder value. Some of his partners would resist this change. Some would argue that he was letting sentiment interfere with sound business judgment. But Richard no longer cared about those objections. He had spent 20 years proving he could generate impressive returns. Now he wanted to prove that success and humanity were not mutually exclusive. The crisis with his portfolio company turned out to be manageable. Richard handled it with his usual efficiency on Monday morning. But he no longer let work consume his entire life. He started blocking out time for activities that nourished his soul rather than just his bank account. He volunteered with music education programs. He mentored young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. He reconnected with his father and started visiting him regularly in Arizona. And once a month, Richard made time to attend performances by musicians his foundation supported. He sat in concert halls and community centers and church basements, listening to people whose talents had almost been lost to poverty and circumstance. Every performance reminded him why he had changed his life. Every musician reminded him of Carmen and the gift she had given him by refusing to let her dreams die. 5 years after that night in the hotel lobby, Richard received an invitation that made him smile. Carmen was giving a solo recital at Jordan Hall, one of Boston's premier concert venues. The program would feature works by Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and several contemporary composers. All proceeds would benefit Carmen's Music Education Foundation, which now operated in 20 cities across the country. Richard flew to Boston for the concert and found himself sitting in a packed hall surrounded by people who had been touched by Carmen's work. Former students, fellow musicians, community members who had benefited from her free music programs. The audience was diverse in every way, united only by their connection to Carmen and their appreciation for her artistry. When Carmen walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous and sustained. She stood at the piano looking out at the hundreds of faces smiling back at her, and Richard could see tears streaming down her cheeks. She had earned this moment through years of sacrifice and determination. Through her refusal to accept that housekeeping was all she would ever be. Through her commitment to lifting others even as she climbed toward her own dreams. Carmen played for 90 minutes without intermission, and every piece was performed with technical mastery and profound emotional depth. This was not just a concert. It was a celebration of what becomes possible when people support each other's potential. When they choose to see the full humanity in everyone they encounter. When they invest in dreams that society has declared impractical or impossible. After the final ovation ended and the crowd began to disperse, Richard made his way backstage. Carmen greeted him with a fierce hug that spoke of gratitude too deep for words. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "Thank you for everything." "Thank you for that night in the hotel lobby," Richard replied. "Thank you for showing me what matters. Thank you for changing my life." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had transformed each other through one unexpected encounter. Then Carmen smiled and said something that Richard would remember forever. "You know what's funny? I used to think that night was the worst thing that could have happened. Getting caught playing piano, having an angry guest complain about me, thinking I was going to lose my job. But it turned out to be the best night of my life. Because you saw me. Really saw me. And that changed everything." Richard nodded, understanding completely. Sometimes the moments that feel like endings are actually beginnings. Sometimes the encounters that seem insignificant contain the seeds of profound transformation. Sometimes one person's willingness to truly see another person creates ripples that spread farther than anyone could have imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.